Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this ITIF event. This is a momentous day if you're a computer geek wonk like we are. This was the day the CAN-SPAM Act was passed 10 years ago, and so we have a really, I think, interesting event this morning. I'm Rob Atkinson, head of ITIF, and we'll introduce the panel here in just a minute. But a little bit of history for those of you who may not have been following this issue back then. Back about 12 years ago, when I was vice president of a group called the Progressive Policy Institute, we actually wrote, I think, probably the very first report on spam and argued it was a big problem and that we needed legislation. And so we actually worked quite closely with two members of Congress at the time, Gene Green, a Democrat from Texas, and Heather Wilson, a Republican from New Mexico. And we had a really, we worked quite closely, actually helped them write the bill, and got a very nice, really strong piece of legislation that passed the House. People don't even remember this. Passed the House, got to the Senate, and for political reasons, which I won't explain in public, but essentially partisan political reasons, because somebody's seat was up and it was an election and they didn't want that person to get credit for this bill, the bill was essentially squashed in the Senate. So in the interim, what happened is that there were some interest in the business community, including in advertising and financial services, that sort of woke up and realized this was actually a pretty strong bill, and they proceeded, in my view, to water it down. And so CAN-SPAM was actually, in our view, a suboptimal bill, but needless to say, it was a bill and it has done some good. But I think that's one of the purposes of the event today, to talk about where we are with that. I just actually, before I came here, I went into my spam file on my email just to see how many I'd gotten over the weekend. 95. And I actually have to go through them all. I go through them pretty quickly, but I do have to go through them all because about 6 of them were actual real emails. I don't know, the sort of problem with our spam filter that Daniel and I talk about, but you see this in other areas as well. So I will start introducing folks on my immediate left. Daniel Castro is a senior analyst at ITIF. Daniel leads all of our IT and internet policy work, and has done a lot of different writing around these issues, including electronic voting, cybersecurity, e-commerce. He has a master's degree in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, and was a visiting scientist at the Software Engineering Institute and in Pittsburgh, and a number of other areas of background. Robert Mahaney is the policy counsel at Google, where he works on consumer protection and competition issues. Prior to that, he was an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission from 2005 to 2012. Since 2009, he's taught government law at GW University Law School, and has worked at a number of different law firms practicing communications law and other regulatory issues. Michael O'Riordan is an engineering fellow at Comcast Cable, where he's been since 2003. He has been involved in the design and operation of publicly facing IT systems for over 20 years. He's currently focused on security issues and has been responsible for the architecture of Comcast anti-spam platform, their anti-bot service, Constant Guard. He's also a board member and chair emeritus of the Messaging, Malware, and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group. He's also on the North American Network Operators Group and the Internet Engineering Task Force, and has a long and distinguished technical background in these areas. And lastly, Colleen Robbins is the Chief of Online Threat Initiatives at the Federal Trade Commission. Her work includes identifying and evaluating high-tech fraud case prospects and litigating spyware, internet fraud, and business opportunity cases. Her most recent case is litigating the Commission's suits against 6 entities responsible for tech support scams that have affected consumers globally. She also coordinated Project Busted Opportunity, during which a dozen federal and state law enforcement agencies brought over 70 actions against fraudulent business opportunity sellers. She also helped prepare FTC's Do Not Email Registry report to Congress, and co-organized the FTC NIST Email Authentication Summit. She also has a law degree from Syracuse University. So, Daniel?
Great. Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming out here. So there's a paper that we should have in the back that talks about the cost of spam. We put this out this summer, trying to kind of assess where we are and where there are opportunities to have policy interventions or technical interventions that might help reduce this cost, which is in many ways a hidden cost. It's something that I think, 10 years ago when the legislation was passed, this is something that consumers actually cared deeply about. When you look at like the Pew reports or USA Today did some public opinion polling back then, this is actually really a serious issue for consumers. And if you look at the polling today, it's not something that consumers care about, but it still is something that has a very large impact, financial impact that consumers aren't aware of. And of course, some consumers do care about it a lot because everyone has a different email service. Some are very good at blocking spam, some aren't. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes kind of talking about what went well with the legislation and kind of what the bad news is today. So in terms of the good news, I think overall we can definitely say that the canned spam was an effective law at creating some common sense standards for commercial email. So now when you receive email from, especially right now in the holiday season, you've probably given your email address to retailers. There are some things that are happening. So there's no false headers. There's no deceptive subject lines. The identity of the sender is clearly marked. If it's an advertisement that's marked, there's a physical address that they have to put somewhere in the email address if you want to get in contact with them. And most importantly for most of us, they have to make an easy way to opt out, and they have to honor that. And so basically what we've seen, I think, over the past 10 years is that any company that's operating legitimately, where they're doing legitimate email direct marketing practices, they're not doing abusive emailing. And especially what we've seen is there are only a few, relatively few number of email marketing companies that provide these services to others. And they all abide by these rules. So that has had a very positive effect. The second kind of big good news is that overall spam volume is significantly lower now than it was in the past. So the peak was around June 2010, when there were about 340 billion spam messages sent daily. Since that time, it's declined to over half of that. I was actually looking last night at some metrics. It had really declined to a tenth of that in October, and then it tripled in the past month. So what you see is that this is kind of continuously a problem, and it's kind of a resurgence, usually around when there are new opportunities to exploit. And the third thing that we see is that even though it's still very difficult to prevent spam from actually being sent, we are getting much better at blocking it from the inbox of consumers, or filtering it out into those spam boxes. This is for a number of reasons. One big reason is that there's about 850 million users worldwide of webmail, and most of those users are in one of three providers, so Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft. And so these companies have a very large volume of email that they can use to identify what is the malicious or fraudulent messages and what's the good mail to let through. We also see very good commercial spam filters, so they have on the high end 99% effectiveness rates and very low false positives. But when you look at the testing, you see that there is a wide variability in the effectiveness of these filters, and not everyone is, of course, using the most effective ones. Okay, so that's the good news. I'd say the bad news is that even though spam has declined, again, we're still kind of at very relatively high levels, and even though there's many technical solutions, not everyone has adopted them. In addition, there's this kind of hidden financial cost. There haven't been many studies recently that have tried to assess this, but we have had three kind of really more in-depth studies over the past 8 years. And since the volumes are more or less the same, we can kind of extrapolate from that. And so what we know is that there's a few costs. So there's direct costs in terms of server capacity, extra bandwidth, there's loss of productivity, there's wasted time on technical support, and then there's all the money spent on the anti-spam technologies. And we know that really no matter how you look at that, we're in the billions just for the United States alone that's being spent. The estimates are between about 15 to 30 billion in the past, there are estimates as high as about 150 billion. So we know it's somewhere in that range. In addition, there's of course the impact that it has on consumer confidence and trust in brands, particularly the brands that are targeted to be exploited. So, right now, if you receive an email from your bank, you're probably not always, you're a little reluctant to click on it. Or companies like FedEx and UPS that have been really targeted in the past is, these are emails that people are used to seeing, they're used to clicking links. These are the type of emails that people try to exploit. And I'd say, so there's a few other kind of bad news here. One is that spammers aren't just doing email spam anymore. Now it's SMS spam, blog spam, Facebook spam, Twitter spam, any social network, any place where there's a form to fill out, any place where there's someone receiving a message. Spammers are targeting those areas as well. And then the last part is that the vast majority of spam is being sent by bots now, or botnets. These are computers that are infected with malware. So what we see is that in the past, what it was literally in some cases someone a man in Virginia that had 10 T1 lines coming into his house, and he was just sitting there with all these computers sending out just tons of spam. Of course, there were questions about why the ISPs didn't ask questions about this to begin with. But now what we see is that it's these massive botnets that are a serious security vulnerability, just in themselves, and they're being exploited for spam purposes. So looking at the situation that we are in now, the question is, what can we do, right? So the first thing is that we really need to recognize that spam is part of this broader cybersecurity problem. There's a few reasons we should look at it that way. One is that if you just try and target spam by itself, then what you typically have is a displacement effect. And we actually saw this in 2010, where there were some attempts to really crack down on spam. So spam went down, and then distributed denial of service attacks went up with the same botnets, because it's basically kind of an economics thing. They just moved to something else. So this is an area that the government can actually be very helpful in. DHS has previously identified targeting botnets and malware as one of the top 11 hard challenges in cybersecurity. And so this is an area where we need to be committing federal R&D dollars to. But even if we do that, creating the technology isn't enough. The next stage is, how do we actually make sure it's adopted? The government can't really fix that problem on its own, because much of this is private sector infrastructure. But there is a lot that we can do to kind of push industry along. So there's a few areas, for example, where we can develop best practices. One is simply just in the use of anti-spam technology, making clear what's good technology, what's not so good, how we can evaluate that, and pushing the adoption of it. Second is really combating botnets and bulletproof hosting. Bulletproof hosting is kind of the middleman out there that's helping facilitate a lot of cyber criminal activity. And we can maybe dig into this a little bit more in the conversation to follow. But this is an area where we see a lot of criminal activity, we see need for law enforcement, and we see this facilitating a lot of criminal actions where we can really intervene. What we've seen is that best practices can actually be very effective at stopping some of this. So FCC helped create an anti-bot code of conduct for ISPs. And one of our recommendations is that really we should be looking at more of these best practices or codes of conduct that could be applied in other areas. So, for example, one problem right now is in affiliate marketing. So there's a lot of e-commerce storefronts, and to help generate leads, they basically give a kickback to anyone who refers a customer to them. This is a legitimate marketing practice, but the problem is spammers can exploit this, and it's basically it's something that encourages spamming in some ways. And so there needs to be rules in place. We need to be thinking about best practices so that we can identify when spammers are abusing these tools and stop it. And then, of course, once we get these best practices, we can promote this internationally. Another issue here is that small businesses really don't have the same kind of expertise as the large businesses in adopting the technology. So smaller recommendations we had in here is that small SBA, for example, they create a lot of guides for small businesses about how to do everything from getting insurance to doing taxes. They should really be focusing on cybersecurity, and they can work with DHS to develop some best practices in this area. And finally, even in procurement, the federal government can really do a lot. Because right now it's not including the productivity costs that it has itself when it's buying these enterprise email or anti-spam technologies. So one of the recommendations we had in this paper was, if we integrate that into the procurement process, we can actually be rewarding companies that are doing very well here and help incentivize the market. The last area I'd say here is that agencies can really start doing more enforcement action, and we need to make sure that they have the resources available to go after cyber criminals, whether it's spammers or botnet operators or anyone else where there's direct harm, financial harm especially, to consumers and businesses. So one avenue is just simply making sure the funding is at the right level. The other interesting thing, especially in spam and a lot of cybercrime actually, is that we've seen the private sector take the lead and help out on a number of these initiatives. And they do it basically three different ways. One, they can just provide technical assistance. So this is when the FBI comes to an ISP and they say, we see some activity, will you help us out? Can we sit down with you and identify this? And that's useful. They've also taken some extrajudicial actions themselves. So sometimes ISPs will actually work together to identify the source of malicious traffic. They will work with ISPs in other countries and get things shut down. And that's very useful, but it opens them up to liability concerns. And of course, we don't have everyone necessarily engaging this, and this can also interfere with law enforcement activities that are ongoing. And the third area is civil lawsuits, and we've seen this also being applied where the private sector actually takes some of these spammers to court, or they're able to get court orders to seize some computers that are causing harm. So what we suggested here is that we consider something like a cyber deputy program, which we really haven't seen anything like this before, where basically create some kind of guidelines so that the private sector can cooperate more easily with law enforcement while protecting their own liability. So we're encouraging the cooperation here, but we're also making sure we're not disrupting any ongoing investigations. At the international level, this is really interesting because we haven't seen a really big engagement on this issue outside of technical standard bodies. Last year at the ITU, actually right about this time, there was these big proposals out there about how different countries can sign on to different proposals on telecom. And there was one proposal at WCIT that was specifically about spam, and the U.S. didn't sign on. There's many reasons why the U.S. didn't want to go down this route. But the takeaway from this is that there are a lot of countries that actually really care about this issue, and they don't have a forum where they can engage. And so the recommendation that we have here is if we're not going to engage in the ITU, then we need to find some kind of forum where the U.S. Wants to make for engaging with spam at the international level. And we're talking about this has been a decade since we implemented canned spam. One of the, I don't know if I'd say it's an irony, but it's interesting at least that Canada is actually in the process right now of implementing their anti-spam legislation. So 10 years later, they're kind of catching up. The actual implementation will be this July. They've still been debating the regulations for the past couple of months. So we're at least ahead of the Canadians on this, and I guess that would be other good news here. Finally, the last recommendation I want to put out, we did say in here that we might want to consider something like a name and shame program to discourage companies from providing services to spammers or other cyber criminals. So there's a lot of countries out there who we could put on a list basically and say, these are the countries that are continually showing up as problematic, either because they're the sources of spam or they're the source of infected computers and they're not doing enough. Or it's that really they have ISPs where they're letting their ISPs get away with activity that they shouldn't. And this has really been a problem in certain countries where there is not really kind of good rule of law. So we want to see more cooperation. We also want to see any companies that are maybe turning a blind eye to some of this, whether it is affiliate marketing programs, banks, or others that are in this kind of ecosystem. There's actually a few control points we might be able to shut this down. We also suggest that the Department of Justice might want to have a 10 most wanted list for botnet operators and use monetary rewards or bounties, which has been very successful in other avenues, to really push back on this. So the takeaway here is that we think it's still a big problem, but there's still so many kind of new ideas that we could add to the mix about how we can go after this. And the goal is really to start engaging people in this type of conversation. So thanks to you guys for coming out, and thanks to the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you. Robert. Just press it once.
Thank you. First, I wanted to thank ITIF for both having this panel and for having me on the panel. I think it's an important panel to have. We often in Washington we look back. We look forward at the emerging problems or what's on the radar right now, and looking back at something that I think we can agree was in many ways a successful law is a useful thing to do, both to see where we're at and also take lessons from something that in many ways has been successful. And looking back, I'd like to do that right now, at CAN-SPAM is illustrative in many ways. And one of the things I think was really important about CAN-SPAM is what Congress did was it identified conduct that was causing real harm to consumers and set about to address the actual conduct that was causing this harm. And you can see this in the findings of CAN-SPAM. One of the things they identified was that there was an unavoidable consumer cost in the storage of the spam, in addition to all the time they were spending, sifting through all this junk mail. And on top of that, it was causing what Congress called a problem with wanted mail getting lost. To quote them, wanted mail was becoming lost, overlooked, or discarded amidst the larger volume of unwanted messages. And I think if you were using email back then, and I was, you probably remember that it was an endemic problem. There was just streams of emails coming in that you just had to filter through, and there was real concern that it was going to basically destroy email as a useful internet tool. The other thing that Congress noted in its findings was that what spam was doing to consumers wasn't just making email harder, it was also forcing vulgar and pornographic messages on consumers. So it was very intrusive, not just to their productivity, but also in other ways as well. And so what did Congress do? It singled out in its findings and in the law itself actual harmful conduct that it found to be causing this kind of behavior. And Daniel actually referred to some of these as well. One of them was misleading headers. It specifically pointed out that misleading headers was a root cause of this problem. Other things, disguised source, the lack of opt-outs or fake opt-outs are also problematic behaviors that Congress noted and sought to address in CAN-SPAM. So I think an important takeaway when we look back on CAN-SPAM is this is an effective way to approach consumer problems on the internet, is to identify an actual harm and look at the evidence, look at the record, figure out what is causing that harm, and then target laws specifically to that harm. I think looking back, the other thing that we can say is the FTC, and I'll defer most of the discussion of the FTC to Colleen, but the FTC has a really strong record when it comes to applying this law. When I was at the commission, I remember having to help prepare testimony about CAN-SPAM back then. And we had a strong record we could draw from. And we could point to the many cases that we brought both in CAN-SPAM and that we brought when it came to spyware and all the other problems of the early internet. But I'll stop talking about the FTC, and I don't want to steal too much of your speech, Colleen. But the other thing to note is that there has been a strong effort of a lot of stakeholders to deal with this issue. But Daniel's right. I mean, spam isn't gone, right? I mean, the numbers that you cite are still pretty high numbers, and because of that, everybody still needs to look at this as an ongoing concern. And at Google, that's something that we're on top of as well. We're continuing to innovate and work hard to improve our spam blocking tool. To back up some of your numbers, one outstanding fact is that we reject roughly the same amount of mail that we deliver to our users. By that I mean there is a large amount of mail that's so malicious or malformed or clearly not from the intended recipient that we don't even serve it up in any shape or form. We flat out block it. So it doesn't show up even in the spam filters. When it comes to emails that aren't so obvious, those are the ones that we use our intelligence to see whether or not it should be served in the inbox or whether we should divert it to the spam filters. And we're talking about multiple billions of emails every month that end up in the spam filters. And rather than our users getting flooded in their inbox with spam, they get diverted. You can do a quick scan every once in a while, and we periodically delete those emails so that you don't have to go through and delete each one. We take care of that for you. Because of these efforts and the continuing efforts that we do to combat spam, it has dropped considerably from what used to be one of the top complaints that we would receive many years ago about Gmail usage from our users, and now it's definitely not that kind of concern for them anymore. I'll talk a second about what our Gmail filters actually do, and how we use, what methods we use to filter out Gmail spam. The first important use is interaction with our Gmail community. When a user reports a message as spam, the user is not only marking it as spam for himself or herself, they're also giving strong feedback to our filters and our algorithms that this message is the kind of message that we should be suspicious about. We've got to remember that spammers often send thousands of identical messages out in a very short period of time. So if there's a lot of spam clicks happening and we can correlate it to that burst, it's a very strong signal for us that this type of email has the attributes that we should learn about and condition our filters to block going forward. It also helps block maybe the second wave of that spam that might come in right at that moment and start diverting those as well. The other thing I'll note is that the report spam signal instructs our filters not only about what spam email can look like, but also what spam email might not look like, right? So there's the other side of the coin that we have to realize as well. If there's a large amount of email that isn't being indicated as spam, maybe a small minority is, but most people are not, then that also is conditioning our email filters to not do false positives as well, which I think is the reverse side of the coin. If the filters are blocking too much, they become useless and people might start turning them off or just migrating to other platforms. The last thing I'll note is that we also not only rely on signals from our users, but also a lot of data analysis to learn about spam as it comes in, aside from the clicking of the little stop button in the corner. We employ a lot of the same technology that we use to make search better, to make sure our filters are operating as intelligently as possible. So I think one of the important takeaways here is, and I think Dan will lay this out as well, is that one of the important pillars here for CAN-SPAM was the company stepping up to the plate and using data innovation in an important way to create spam filters and make them extremely useful for users. I think CAN-SPAM was important, enforcement from regulators was very important, but an important, I guess, third leg of the stool was to make sure that companies had the freedom to be able to analyze data in ways that really helped thwart the problem, at least when it comes from an end user perspective. I think we still have problems when it comes to productivity, with companies having to deal with it. Obviously, spamming can migrate to other platforms, and Daniel laid out some of those. But when it comes to email itself, really the core thing, I think, for the past 10 years was the freedom that companies had to analyze data and apply it in a way that really helped address this consumer harm. So what are some new problems and new things that are happening and things that we're working on? One thing that, as Daniel pointed out, we have to be aware of the migration of bad actors to other platforms. I think the FTC is on top of the SMS spamming issue. Colleen will probably refer to some cases that they're bringing there. There's obviously spam happening on social messages, and I think those companies are working hard on those issues. Google Plus is also a social platform, so all the companies in that space are bringing their resources to bear there. Another issue that we have to be aware of is something we call soft spam, I guess. And this is, you got to remember, one person's spam might not be another person's spam. And so, what we have to be aware of is making sure that we don't have a lot of soft positives. And to help solve that issue, we've introduced this tabbed Gmail, and some of you may have used it, that sorts things into folders that make maybe clicking spam on things less necessary. So we have a social tab. We were seeing that a lot of users were clicking spam for that LinkedIn message you'd get, or you got another friend on Facebook, or all of those things, and clicking spam on those. Well, those are legitimate emails. They're not spam. And so decreasing those kinds of false positive clicks was one of the driving forces, one of the benefits of creating the tabbed Gmail folders. The same thing with promotions, right? I mean, if they're all getting filtered into your promotions tab and you can do a quick scan the way you kind of scan your Gmail folder, I'm sorry, your spam folder, like, oh, I don't really need any of those, I'll just ignore those for now. You're not clicking that, you're not getting annoyed and hitting that spam button the way you used to. So we're trying to decrease false positives by bringing these kinds of tools out. The other thing I'll note is we have tools in Gmail that allow for easier unsubscribe, and this is something that we're working on all the time as well, to allow people to unsubscribe from message lists or promotion blasts that they may have joined into, and trying to make that easier will also help cut down on the false positive problem, as well as the need for people to like worry about, oh, I'm just continually getting this email and it's soft spam and it's making my experience worse. The last thing I'll note is that authentication has been an important part of the efforts here. We've seen an uptake in authentication domains. I think we can say that we're over 90%. We did a blog post earlier this year of emails coming in from authenticated sources. This is the adoption of DKIM and SPF and these kinds of authentication domains, which helps increase the probability that something is not spam. So the collaborative efforts to create authentication standards by companies has been extremely important in this effort, and one of the successes that we've seen in stakeholder collaboration in this space. So, I think the key takeaway here is that, as Daniel has pointed out, this is an ongoing problem and something that we need to be vigilant about as an internet community. At Google, we're continually vigilant about it and continually spending a lot of resources to improve not only our filters, but tools that make those filters better by improving the email experience of our end users. But that's really only one part of the problem, right? Solving the end user experience. We have to work on ways to stop the problem throughout the chain, because spam may not be a problem for everyday users like it was 10 years ago, but it's still an ongoing concern for corporate budgets, for cybersecurity concerns, and things like that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Michael.
Well, I've been around in the sort of spam business about as long as the CAN spam law's been there. Sort of started 2003-ish. And I remember quite well the predictions that in 2 years' time, I think it was a fairly famous chair or CEO of a large software operating system vendor made the prediction that spam would be sorted in 2 years' time. Well, it hasn't quite happened, because over the past few years I've had to architect anti-spam platforms, architect anti-bot platforms, and give a lot of direction to a substantial ISP on how we're going to go forward from a technical perspective. And at the same time, we've had to do an awful lot of work to bring together an industry consensus. So, I chaired Morg for 5 years, where we looked at dealing with spam, but then also, more importantly, dealing with the increasing problem of malware, which I think has really become the problem that we all have to be most concerned about now. Spam is part of the problem. The overall problem really sits back on malware, and it sits on the botnets, because the botnets are the cause, or the other place from where all this spam comes. There's been a lot of work done by institutions like the FCC with production of the anti-bot code, and they're currently working on things like server-based DDoS. So there's a lot of work going on to create some of these codes of conduct. Now, how successful they've proven to be, or will prove to be over time, I think we still have to look at that. So I'm not really going to comment too much on the efficacy of the law itself. I'm an engineer. Well, actually, very funnily enough, I'm sort of an engineer. I actually have a law degree, which is kind of ironic, really. But when I look at it, the legislation from an engineer's perspective, I say it has its place. Legislation is great because it means that society has formally recognised some particular action as bad. We've declared spam to be a bad thing. So it's been very useful for us to codify that offence. It's really useful for us to be able to prosecute for those offences. We can take someone to court. The occasional perp walk is really useful because it frightens off some of the less serious players. They've got to know that there's a risk doing this, and I think that's important. But one of the things is just having a law doesn't actually stop anything. If laws stopped anything, none of us would be parking in the wrong places, and we certainly wouldn't be speeding down the freeway. So what we've seen is that the laws are useful, the laws have their place, but they haven't brought everything to a crashing halt, which is unfortunate. So, what's the size of the problem really? For a number of years, as I say, I chaired MORG, the Messaging, Malware and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group, and since 2005 we've measured the size of the spam problem. We've got, and in our members, I think it's well over 500 million mailboxes that we look after, and they come globally. So we've got members in France, Germany, Spain, Russia, Japan, all over the United States, South America. So we've got pretty global membership, and we've been measuring spam since 2005. And we actually, I have to say, we don't measure spam, we measure unwanted emails, because I think one of the challenges we have with spam is it's defined globally in different ways. In France it's defined one way, in Germany it's defined another. In certain countries it's not defined at all. I mean, this is going to be particularly a problem for the emerging economies. And what we've seen is that based on our measurement of unwanted emails, between 85 and 90% of all the email that all our member ISPs see is unwanted. Now, obviously, some of that could be, be clicked because they don't want to see that joke from grandma. It could be clicked for all sorts of reasons, but by and large, we don't believe that's the sort of majority of the mail. I've been billed as being an engineering fellow at Comcast, so here's a couple of Comcast statistics, which are always interesting. So on a good day, we see about 250 million attempts at Comcast for people to send email to us. On a bad day, we see 600 million. And a few years ago, I remember seeing on days like Thanksgiving, in the order of 1 billion attempts to send us email. 90 to 95% of that is spam. We reject it. We reject it at the front door. Don't let this stuff in. So if we've got a problem there, I think one of the challenges is, and it was referred to earlier, is what are the emerging economies going to do? You've got countries that are just, freshly wired. I was out in Kenya not so long ago talking to a bunch of regulators. And the regulators weren't just from Kenya, they were from Mali, they were from Botswana, Burundi, all sorts of places which are just coming onto the internet. And spam's going to be a very big problem for them because, relatively speaking, they don't have that much bandwidth. They don't have any legislation to deal with it. And the other bit is, when spam starts coming out of a country, it damages their reputation. What's Nigeria famous for? 419. It's the one section of the Nigerian criminal code that most of us know. It's that it's that section that we know which is about cyber scams. I mean, there are even songs about it. I mean, I've named 2 of my Nigerian dwarf goats Spam and Fish. And unless we address that, it's going to get worse. So what are the kind of measures that are out there at the moment? Well, obviously we've got the legal one that we're all here to, I guess in inverted commas, honour, the CAN-SPAM. But then there's a whole bunch of technical standards, and my colleague here, Roberts, has already talked about some of them, but maybe I'll go into a little more detail. So we've got SPF, which lets us know, are these particular servers authorised to send mail on behalf of this particular domain? We've got DKIM, which says, I'm going to sign this mail as me having been the originator of it, or the domain having been the originator of it. Now that was great, and those standards were around for a little while, and everybody went sort of ho-hum, so we're authenticating email, really isn't making an enormous amount of difference. So just recently, there's another set of standards you may or may not have heard of, which is DMARC, Domain-Based Messaging Authentication Reporting and Conformance. And I had to look that up on my iPhone while everybody else was speaking because it's such a mouthful, I couldn't quite remember what it stood for. But really what it's saying is, it's telling people who send mail, it's the people who are sending mail saying, this is what you can do with mail if it doesn't pass the authentication tests. If this mail it says it comes from, let's say, Yahoo, if it fails to pass the tests which are prescribed here, you can bin it, you can junk it, you can get rid of it safely. This has proved to be massively effective in suppressing email. In suppressing unwanted email. I don't have the exact statistics, but I'd suggest that anybody that's interested go to dmarc.org and have a look, because that has proved to be very, very effective. I mean, there's extensive vendor activities going on. We talk about the manufacturers of anti-spam technology. There's an awful lot of very, very good cloud-based stuff which is out there, and that work's been going on for a considerable amount of time, and some very, very effective anti-spam technology has been produced. But I actually think that where we are really seeing the biggest success, and sometimes I think it's overlooked, or people go, well, why isn't industry working together, is in the industry bodies that have come together to deal with spam. And I'm going to talk about Morg because, as I say, I've chaired it for a number of years. We started in 2004 when, the spam problem looked pretty horrendous. Spam was such that people were concerned that all the email would get, real legitimate email would get buried, and that people would just give up on email as a means of communication. But over the period since 2004, Morg's come out with a whole bunch of best practices. Best practices actually exist. They're freely available. We don't sort of come out with these best practices at Morg and then hide them away, because it would be really daft. We publish them out on our web pages. They're freely available, and they have been put together by some of the best people in the industry. The kind of people that work on best practices at Morg are the kind of people that have already written the SMTP standard, the people that invented DNS. These people all get together to actually come out and produce these best practices, which are available. So we've got practices, and really important ones like blocking port 25. When I was out talking to these folks in Kenya, they were saying, well, we're we're emerging economies, not got a lot of money to really spend on this because fresh water is probably a more important problem than it is for our inhabitants than spam. But we know that spam is going to be a problem over time. And I said, well, the cheapest thing you can do is block port 25. You can stop as people come on the net for your countries, you can stop them sending spam. You can avoid the Nigerian situation.
Michael, you just want to explain what that means to people?
Port 25 is the port in which people send email. It's the SMTP port. And if you stop people using port 25 directly, they can't send email from their own machine directly to the internet. It has to go through somebody else's server. And at that point, controls can be applied. Talk about a cheap solution. We're talking a few lines in a config file here, which can actually create major obstacles for spammers. And there's all sorts of other work that's been going on. Morg's come out with best practices on how you manage your DNS, how you manage dynamic space. When you have an awful lot of subscribers as an ISP, you allocate them IP addresses dynamically. That address space is known. It's understood. So virtually all the ISPs, for example, in the United States, say this is our dynamic space. Don't accept email if it originates from an IP address within that piece of dynamic space, because if it does, the likelihood is it's a botted machine, and it shouldn't be sending email directly. It should be going through a particular server, like at Yahoo or at Google or at Microsoft, or dare I say it, at Comcast. Morg also works with the senders, because the reputable senders want to see email maintained as a viable way of communication. They make their living sending mail on behalf of Nike and on behalf of the transactional email on behalf of the banks, and small companies want to advertise their products. It's really strange. I ride a lot of motorbikes, and my motorbike maintenance guy updates me using one of these small services, Constant Contact. These services provide a real benefit to small industry, the one-man band who wants to contact his customers. What else has Morg been up to? Well, it was quite fun. A little while back, we got contacted by an institution called the East-West Institute. People may or may not have heard of it. They do an awful lot of what sound like quite interesting negotiations between just some government level, anything from sort of how to make cable ships be able to get into coastal waters to repair cables, to facilitating discussions between parties that don't quite want to talk to each other a lot. So one of the challenges they took on was to try and get Chinese government, or China and the United States, talking about cybersecurity, which on occasion we've known to be slightly hot button. So they decided, what's an area where everybody recognises it to be a bad thing? Well, we all recognise, no matter how much other sort of fun we may be getting up to with each other's systems, that spam is inherently a bad thing. So what they got together was they got together a group of people from China, and they got together a group of people from the United States, and they worked on a set of best practices, the majority of which were certainly Morg best practices, and then they vetted this stuff with us. And they also asked us to be the technical sort of implementer and guardian of this agreement going forward. And so, I mean, that shows the regard that Morg's held in. What else has Morg been doing? We've also been trying to spread the word globally. We have got now a chapter in India. India is a massive, massive emerging nation on the cyber scene. And the volumes of spam that were coming out of India and have been coming out of India are quite considerable. So we now have got a chapter in India which is working with major Indian service providers to actually work on best practices, and also to do it on a local basis, so that it's not seen as, you know, a bunch of people coming in and saying this is what you should do, this is how you should do it, but allowing that culture to develop within the Indian service provider community, which I think is really important. And on the last bits that we've been doing is we've been working on how do we educate people that aren't within our normal subscriber base. And as I said, I was out in Kenya not so long ago, where we have, under the auspices of what we call the Messaging, Malware and Mobile Anti-Abuse Foundation, where we're aiming to provide training to service providers in emerging economies so that they can actually implement the best practices that have been developed at Morg, because we want to see them further developed. Because it's in, you know, to be blunt, it's in everybody's interest to stop the spam stop the spam problem in emerging economies before it starts. Where else is there industry action going on? Well, you've got the IETF, which is as a result of the recent challenges we've had with elements of pervasive monitoring from a number of bodies around the world. The IETF has decided to revisit some of the basic protocols, and they're going to be revisiting with security in mind. And I feel this is going to have an inevitable beneficial knock-on effect when it comes to dealing with spam, because as we can make our protocols more security aware, more security conscious, then we can actually tighten up on things. What other industry action? I mean, I know I'm harping on industry action, but as I say, I believe when I come to DC, all too often I hear that, oh, what's industry doing? They're not all getting together. Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, you've got Morg, you've got organisations like the Online Trust Alliance, you've got Microsoft with its Digital Crimes Consortium, you've got the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance up in Pittsburgh, and all sorts of individual little working groups that come out. I mean, people may remember a few years ago there was this Conficker bot, and you know, the days ticked down, and there was a day when Conficker was going to come live, and we were all sitting there wondering what's Conficker all about, and it turned out to be the biggest letdown. Well, maybe not a letdown, maybe, you know, if you wanted a little excitement it was a letdown, but actually it was a really cool thing that it did apparently nothing, which was quite a relief. We're seeing more in the way of bot takedowns. I mean, looking at the DNS working group and then the Microsoft B series of takedowns, there's a bunch of smaller industry bodies such as Ops Trust, which I think if you have a chance to look at would be a good idea. It's a small collection of security professionals that can work on these things. So, in essence, what I would like to say is that industry action is being taken. It's being taken globally, and it's been proven to be very effective. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. Holly?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the FTC's spam program. And our spam program is really made up of three things: enforcement, research, and consumer and business education. And so first I want to just go through our enforcement actions and what the FTC has done. Really since 1997, the FTC has been in this area of spam. Sorry. It's not working.
There you go.
It's not moving forward.
Bethany, can you?
Oh, there we go. Okay. No, I probably won't. Yeah, no, there we go. Okay, so first, we know about the Can Spam Act. Obviously, that's why we're here. But there are other tools that the FTC has to bring spam cases and malware and spyware cases, and that is Section 5 of the FTC Act. And the nice thing about Section 5 is that it's not really tied to anything specific, so it's very nimble. We can go after a lot of different types of cases with this, with Section 5, which really just says that unfair, deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce are unlawful. And so that's very broad. And so it helps us to bring actions in this area without having a specific law targeted towards this type of technology. And then, of course, this is not. Oh, there we go. Then, of course, we have the CAN-SPAM Act, and it's I believe that Dan already went through the different areas in which that are prohibited: the false or misleading header information, deceptive subject lines, etc. And so those are the types of cases that the FTC has brought based on these areas. And there's also, which someone mentioned, the adult labeling rule also went into effect under CAN-SPAM. And we really did see a tremendous effect from this particular section of the CAN-SPAM Act on email that was sexually explicit. So FTC enforcement under the CAN-SPAM Act, it's very similar to Section 5 enforcement in that we can get injunctive relief without having to prove knowledge. But there are also, on top of that, we can get civil penalties. And there are other federal regulators that also can bring actions under CAN-SPAM. So this is a really tiny slide. I didn't realize how small it was going to be. But I just wanted to sort of highlight really what we've been doing since 1997. We've brought more than 100 spam cases, 32 of which were under the CAN-SPAM Act. But as you can see, since we brought over 100 cases, many of those obviously were not brought under CAN-SPAM, but we were still effectively able to bring spam, malware, spyware type cases. So I've highlighted a few. One I want to just mention, the spam text messaging cases. We filed 7 cases recently, and what they did was they promoted, it was text messages that promoted free gifts. And in the end, obviously it wasn't free for consumers, and they got signed up for all sorts of continuity plans, and they had to buy all sorts of things to try to get their free gift. But the interesting thing about these cases is that they weren't necessarily, we filed not only against the merchants, but we filed suits against the affiliate networks and the affiliates themselves. So as Dan had pointed out, that affiliate marketing is a big problem in this area. So we filed these cases really targeting all 3 levels. And another interesting point, once after we filed those 7 cases, Cloudmark actually came out with a statistic that the daily rates of spam dropped 40% after these cases were filed.
By the way, that's not me on that Atkinson thing. That was my brother.
So our spam cases have targeted spoofing, they've targeted phishing, remove me claims, subject line, deceptive subject lines, and basically false claims. So we've kind of run the gamut with our cases. And we've cooperated with other federal agencies, other state agencies to bring these cases. And one thing I wanted to point out as well is another enforcement action we brought that we didn't necessarily bring just because to stop spam, but we brought a case against a rogue ISP called 3FN. And after we brought that case, spam dropped, I can't remember the exact statistic, I think it was 50% worldwide after we brought that case, because what we did was we asked a court to shut the ISP down, and the court did. And so we brought cases that have actually had an effect on spam. Of course, they moved to another botnet, and it goes up again. But at least we're working hard to try to contain it. So aside from our enforcement actions, another piece of what we do is we try to research these issues and try to see what's happening, and then how best can we target our enforcement. So these are things we've done in the past, where we've done trying to figure out where are spammers getting, this was a long time ago, where are spammers trying to getting email addresses from, what kinds of claims are being made in spam, are e-tailers actually complying with CAN-SPAM's opt-out. And then Operation Secure Your Server, we sent out letters to people who had open proxies saying, this is what's happening, you need to close your servers. So as part of our enforcement efforts, we actually try to figure out what the problems are, what are the emerging problems, and how can then we best target our enforcement. And then on top of that, we've also had several forums to address these issues. So we've had the FTC Spam Forum in 2003, the Email Authentication Summit in 2004. That was, we held the Email Authentication Summit based on the Do Not Email report that we had sent to Congress, saying that this is what we're going to try to do, is bring industry together to talk about the email authentication efforts. And then we brought another Spam Summit in 2007, and most recently, this past June, we brought a mobile forum where we talked about mobile malware and such. So we're always trying to stay ahead of the curve, or at least in the curve, to try to research these issues. And then the last part of our spam program is consumer education and business education. And one thing that the FTC does, we do a lot of things really well, but one of our missions is to tell consumers and help consumers and inform them about what's happening and how they can help themselves. So we have a lot of links on our website for consumers, a lot of information for consumers and for businesses, for business education particularly about the CAN-SPAM Act, how do they comply. And so we really try to do a lot of outreach in that way. And these are just some more of our consumer and business education materials. And and I forgot to say at the beginning, these comments are of my own and not of the Federal Trade Commissioners. But that's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you. Before we open it up to folks, I just want to ask a couple questions. What percentage do you all estimate of spam in the U.S. that comes into the U.S. is in violation of the CAN-SPAM Act?
I couldn't give a percentage. I don't know.
I mean, see, Robert, you said you get rid of 50% or 50% right away, which you would assume that amount is in violation of the CAN-SPAM Act.
Right. So I don't know if I can give you a percentage, but it's a large number,
yeah.
Right? I mean, we have to remember that there are a lot of emails that nobody sees, right? Because that those come in from Comcast's work and other email providers just kill them outright. Then it also gets difficult in figuring percentages because you also have the soft spam issue and what are those signals really telling you, right? And then on top of that, you have the definitional problems of what spam means across the world and how does that impact coming up with the percentage. But I would say that if an email isn't even good enough to show to our spam filters, I'd probably say that's a pretty strong indicator that it probably violates CAN-SPAM. It's not my legal opinion, but just a guess that that's probably problematic.
Yeah. So it ties into my real question, which is, Michael, you were alluding to the kind of engineering view of the world, and engineers always have a particular view of the world. You can solve everything by better engineering, lawyers by better laws and more enforcement, and economists by taxes. So I think all three of these things are actually useful, but let me focus on enforcement because the technical solutions tend to be sort of after they're sort of defensive in a way. And I guess my question would be, how much do we have to go after? How much are other countries enabling this, either out of ignorance or out of just complicity? And if so, how much do we need a better global regime to enable better enforcement globally?
I think you asked me that a global regime sounds sort of rather absolutist. I think what we do need is
we have trade agreements that are also called global regimes,
okay.
For example.
I think we do need to enable something on a global basis. I'm not going to speak to the policy aspects because I don't know that I feel particularly well equipped to do so, but we do need to educate people better in the emerging economies to actually be able to better deal with this problem. And it's not something that I think you can do by sort of government fiat. You've actually got to do a lot of this by getting boots on the ground and actually training people in the basic techniques, because a lot of people seem to think that dealing with spam from a technical perspective is complicated. It's not. It's well understood technology. I mean, I made reference earlier to sort of blocking port 25. A lot of these techniques and the technologies are well understood. They're not stunningly expensive to implement in most cases, and they can be very, very effective in their results.
Yeah, Colleen, how much do you have? A lot of, I would assume, a lot of the violators that you see are not in this country.
Mhm.
And what is your level of recourse when you see that?
So we have a great statute called Safe Web Act that allows us to go after actors that are overseas as long as there's conduct that occurs in the United States. So, for example, with the tech support cases that we brought, all of the defendants but one are in India. And all the companies but one are in India. But we were still able to file our cases because they were affecting and remoting into U.S. consumers' computers. And we are able to obtain consumer redress for consumers that are overseas as well. We have the statutory authority to do that, and so we do it when we can. When we have that U.S. connection.
But doesn't that also, though, depend upon the foreign courts being willing to go along with that?
No, because we file in the United States. What it does depend on, so for example, in the tech support cases, we obtained asset freezes of all the defendants' assets. So we filed our TRO with the foreign banks, and they don't comply because they don't have to. So that hinders us. But we go to a U.S. court and that judge is the one that issues the order. So it does affect us in some way, and it limits us in some way. But I think it also, we need to bring these cases because I think it does send a message. I mean, I liked the perp walk comment. I mean, it does send a message though that we're not, just because you're overseas doesn't mean you're untouchable, and we're going to do what we can. To be, with the statutes that we have, and we're gonna pursue these.
I'll just note that I think the FTC has been picking up MOUs, memorandums of understanding with other countries. I think they just picked up one with Nigeria, and I think that's an effective way to smooth out these kinds of cross-border frictions. And I'm sure they'll continue to work on that and get more and more of those under the belt, but they have a good number of them that I think helps with that issue.
I helped negotiate with the Nigeria, and I was on the Wicked delegation. I was the spam person. It's scary. People can hear.
Yeah, people can hear.
So what's interesting about the Nigerian MOU, my name is Betsy Broder, and I'm a colleague of Colleen's, and I'm in the Office of International Affairs. So Nigeria is a real problem. So when I was in Dubai for the Wicked, I heard a Nigerian who was with a telecom say he went to the gold market to buy a gift for his wife. And the vendor said, well, show me your passport and give me a letter from your embassy. And make sure, I need to talk to your hotel. There's absolutely no trust because this is what's happened with Nigeria. And so the 419 scams have tainted the entire country, which is why it's so important for us to build partnerships with our counterparts there. So the MOU that the Federal Trade Commission has is both with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, which is a criminal enforcement authority, and the Consumer Protection Council, which is like our equivalent. So we're trying to achieve two things. First, to improve communication, data sharing, coordination between our agencies, but also to get the civil and criminal agencies in that country connected. And so just the way, like 3FN, we brought our civil case, and then I believe there was a follow-on criminal case, so we have a robust criminal referral program, and we would like to encourage the same thing there. So building these networks also through, as Michael knows, the London Action Plan, which is a multinational network, mostly of civil regulators and enforcers on anti-spam, so that we're all kind of in the same room talking about the same challenges.
So just to sort of push a little farther on that, that fundamentally depends upon the Nigerian government agreeing and saying this is a good thing, and they do. But there are other countries that don't. I mean, for a long time, I don't know what the latest data are, but the Canadians were the source of an enormous amount of spam. They've been on the 301, which is the USTR, United States Trade Representative watch list for IP theft for 20 years in a row. They really made very little effort to control their spam, and yet they're a civilized country next to us and rule of law and all that. So I guess a couple thoughts for anybody, whether it's you or anybody on the panel. Do we need, I think Michael or Robert, you made this point that, do we need a sort of 301 list for internet malfeasance? In other words, measuring what countries are doing in terms of their blindness or cooperation or complicity with internet malfeasance, and then begin to rank countries to name and shame them?
Maybe it can be formalised, but I mean, we already know where the bad ones are because we measure them. Everybody, there are a number of groups out there measuring them every day, and we know where they are. Whether policy, whether the government chooses to formalise that's another matter entirely. It's not that the data is unavailable. That data is very well established, and you know whether it's worth going after particular botnets, for example. But, what sort of action you need to take against particular botnets where there's good cooperation. I mean, the recent DNS change one was a particularly good one. There's a bunch of Estonians who are coming across for some involuntary holidays in the United States in the not too distant future because they were prepared to work, with law enforcement. On the other hand, there are botnets which are known to be, to have command and controls and to have the people that are actually running them in legislation suite or in areas where you're never going to be able to get it because they've got too much protection of one sort or another.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We may know that, but there's no sort of formalized pressures from countries to whether it's the OECD could have something like this that we would put real pressures on countries and exclude them or put them inside in the global trading system. Right now, they seem to be able to operate with some level of impunity. Why don't we just open it up for folks here, Bob?
I have a question for Colleen. I wonder if you could talk, and I want to get into nuts and bolts, about what you have to do to focus on a particular spammer when you're going to bring a case, and what kind of activities you have to go to collect the data and to actually bring the case.
So a lot of our cases they're either brought based on complaints that we receive. So if we receive an inordinate amount of complaints from consumers, that will help us target particular individuals. But also we receive a lot of information from our industry, partners that we work with that say, that help us to target certain individuals or areas. But once we go from there, you're talking about the nitty-gritty of investigation. So we have civil enforcement authority where we use civil investigative demands. They're similar to subpoenas. So we can use that to get information from ISPs. We use it to get information from registrars, from phone companies, from banks, from and a lot of what we do is we follow the money. And so, it's very difficult to trace, email headers and things like that. I mean, because they're generally not accurate. But we have very good success in following the money. And so that's really what we do is we use our powers to get information from companies, and we use that to hone in on our investigation and such. So.
Other questions?
I've had some involvement with the issue for a while and actually served in the original FTC task force back in the 90s on the subject. And there were a number of issues that were identified as the Spam Act evolved and since. I was wondering if any of the people on the panel could comment on how these have evolved and been treated. One is what we often refer to as the sort of Somali complex, which is that if a country cannot enforce its own laws, regardless of what international agreements it has with the United States or any other country, it's not going to be able to enforce another country's laws, so that you'll have havens of spammers that will emerge because of either inability or unwillingness of the local government to deal with them. The second was the issue of false positives, in which people could be identified as spammers for lots of reasons, including they're my competitor, or I don't like them, or whatever, and thus large numbers of legitimate commercial speakers would be blocked. And the third was censorship, that it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how the principles of blocking unwanted commercial email can easily be applied to blocking commercial, political, or other speech, including the lack of anonymity. And so, there's like 3 or 4 issues. I'm just wondering if any of the panelists could comment on how they've evolved and how they've been treated.
I'll jump in on the last one on censorship, because I think this is an issue that gets raised a lot when we talk about any kind of restriction on an activity online. There's often a complaint that if you block a website, if you block a service, if you block something, that's almost by definition censorship. And I think it's helpful to move away from it. I think what we saw with the CAN-SPAM Act is that it provided a very good way to do that, because it said, one, it was talking about commercial email. So and of course other countries have done it differently, right? So that can be a different classification. But first, it's only commercial email. Second, we apply certain rules by which you have to behave. So as long as you're behaving by those rules, you can speak as much as you want. And we're only saying that if you don't comply with that, that's where the problem is. And I think that's an effective way of circumventing the issue about censorship, because what we've seen, when we look at the billions of emails that are sent that are spam, and the percentage of that's malware, and what we're blocking is not, it's not censorship, at least on the whole. That's what the problem is.
Are you saying you don't think any political speech is being blocked?
No, I'm saying that when we're looking at the problem today and what most commercial email providers are trying to block, they're not blocking things that are political speech. And so, I think it's just so far removed from the problem that people are trying to solve that it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's that there are avenues still for legitimate speech.
I think a related point, Roger, I think, at least in our view, there's all these people who will say, oh, well, this is just going to give, we can get into this spam issue with the ITU, and I'm sure there were lots of different things going on there. But just looking at it on sort of the issue per se, we didn't have a problem with countries saying they have a problem with spam and they need to address it. Now people would say, oh, well, that's a certain government now will use that as an excuse. They don't need an excuse. They don't need an excuse. Governments larger, there are many governments who can and do whatever they want on the internet. And they don't need an excuse. And this notion somehow that if you legitimize spam as an area of focus for policy, that they're then giving carte blanche to.
That was the issue, really. That it would be a cover for blocking.
Yeah, but I think that's our view is that's a moot point, because they don't need cover. It's not as if countries are not doing that already. So the question is, are there legitimate things countries can do, as we have done as a country, that seems to get the balance right? And I think that's, to us, what the U.S. should be pushing for, rather than saying, oh, we're not even going to touch this because it can be used to win. But other folks may have a different view on that.
I'll just weigh in and say, I largely agree. We do need to be cognizant of, generally, consumer protection being used globally as a censorship tool. I agree with that. I think that there are regimes that try to put out a pretense of using consumer protection, but it's really dressed up censorship. But there was, I think, Russia recently passed a online child safety law, and you can imagine what they think is in the bucket of offensive to children, right? And a regime that has, strong concerns about their treatment of the LGBT community, you can understand why that could be used as a censorship tool. So I think it's a legitimate concern. I think we're seeing that kind of concern when it comes to global standards. But I do largely agree that I think it is more of a mood issue when it comes to spam. As you noted, the 3 main providers of email, including Gmail, Microsoft, and Yahoo, work really hard on their tools, right? And to make sure that we don't get the kind of false positive that you're referring to. Now, if a user wants to keep clicking on that email from that congressperson as spam, then that's a signal for that user, right? But I think that we're trying hard to make sure that we introduce tools that don't create that ripple effect that makes that legitimate political message end up in everybody's spam folders.
So if somebody clicks "this is spam" on a political message, you ignore that, or you accept that as in your database as spam?
Well, I mean, it takes a lot of clicks to make something turn into spam, right? So if one user is clicking it, that's a data point.
So the Tea Party organizes to, tell everybody to, or it doesn't make a difference. Anybody organizes to tell everybody click on this as spam. With that, could a organized effort result in your blocking political speech because you have enough reports that it's spam, regardless of what the actual content of it is?
No, I think there are, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of signals that we look at, and it isn't just that click, right? And so, if there's an authenticated email coming from the White House about signing up for Obamacare or something like that, the Tea Partiers think that they could click that out of existence. There are strong signals that that's not spam. It's coming from the White House, right? It's authenticated. There are a lot of signals that we would take into account before we automatically would just go with that. So I think, as I mentioned before, user feedback is critical in figuring out what is and isn't spam. But there are a host of other signals that we use to make sure that we're sorting things properly and not falling for any particular scheme, or less nefariously listening to signals that, everybody was clicking, a lot of people were clicking, this Facebook message or this Google Plus message or whatever, these are spam, I'm just going to keep clicking spam. So we were able to avoid sticking all those in the spam filter for a lot of different reasons, looking beyond just the clicking of that button.
Yeah, I think Robert's absolutely right. I mean, there are a kind of set of balanced signals that you take. You don't just rely on one set of signals. You have to rely on a whole bunch of them. And I don't think any of the large ISPs are just going to rely on a single set or a single type of signal in order to decide that you've got it's a spam message.
How do we avoid conflicting laws? And this is actually the topic of a forthcoming ITIF report on sort of conflicting laws when it comes to any internet, the global policy question, not just spam. But the case is a good one in spam. What if the Canadians had a law that said they needed an ADV in the header, and we don't, or in the subject line, I should say? What do you do? I mean, how do we? You could imagine a set of laws that someone, by definition, a legitimate spammer, will be in violation of the law because they can't maybe segregate their database by geographic location of the user or the recipient, and so one country is saying you got to do this, another country is saying you can't do that. First of all, is that just totally hypothetical? And secondly, if it's not, what do we do?
Well, I think right now there's different spam laws in different countries, and so right now spam is defined in different ways. So, so as of right now, spammers, theoretically, or people sending email, are going to have to know that sending it to one country is going to mean that this is spam, and sending it to another country it's not. So, I think they'd have to figure out from their database, where are these emails going? Marketers know where they're sending their emails to. So I think they would have to follow the laws in those particular countries.
We certainly don't. I suppose we could if we hired somebody, but we have a database that's very, very large from all around the world, and people sign up, and or somebody at a meeting in China gives me their business card and says, "Put me on your list." So yeah, large marketers have this capability, but it seems to me that small companies could really get caught in the crosshairs here of not really being able to figure out who they are. Now, I guess the question would be, would countries go after smaller companies and only the big guys. But
Well, I think we do need to always be cognizant of those kinds of conflicting potentials in globally and even in the United States, right? We have a lot of states here. I think last count there are many dozens of state data breach notification laws, right? And so we do have to be cognizant when we're looking at potential solutions to not be fragmenting the internet or online service usage in a way that becomes a problem. So I think your example would be a hard one to deal with, right? I think it wouldn't be a good thing to say, well, every marketer now needs to collect the home location of the user. I mean, I think I can think of concerns with that, consumer protection concerns with creating, that kind of list, because now we need to worry about this Canadian header law and this other state has this other law and whatnot. So I think we do need to be cognizant of the harm to consumer welfare in creating these kinds of disparate laws, and there is sort of a good there is value to coming up with more standardized laws in that effect. And I think, if I recall correctly, commissioners have spoken about the data breach situation and how data breach notification, a national standard, would be pretty useful. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
I think the U.S. is an easy case here because we're an opt-out regime. So if you send spam is not per se illegal. Sending it under certain circumstances is unlawful. So if someone sends me an email and I opt out, then they're prohibited. Other regimes have opt-in. You can't send commercial email at all unless the consumer has affirmatively said, send to me. And I think that raises the more challenging issues. We're kind of the easy case in the US in terms of compliance. And it gives them an opportunity to say, now you can comply with the law. Now we've told you, we don't want it, and they're obligated to put us on their, or to remove us from their mailing list.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the challenge there is, opt-ins aren't going to like opt-outs, and opt-outs aren't going to like opt-ins. And we see that in privacy, we see it in spam, and then you get into this question of, is there a real conflict in terms of rule of law? And because we haven't really seen that yet, but it seems to me we could as we go forward. So before we close, let me just ask each of the panelists maybe for a closing comment of 30 to 60 seconds, kind of what would be the kind of one or two things. What I take away from this panel is we've made progress. Other countries are making progress, some are, and yet we still have serious challenges, particularly around this is the vector for malware. And there are things that we can do both in the public sector and the private sector, so and both domestically and globally. So a couple things you think we can or should be doing. Daniel?
Great. Well, I'd say one of the big takeaways is just that this is an area that continues to evolve. That's what we've seen over the past 10 years, and that's what we're seeing today. And so, even now as we try and work to resolve some of the issues that we have in terms of forming international partnerships, I think the next big challenge will be on identification, especially when some of the bad actors are, behind the level of botnets or behind, a level of a third-party criminal actor who's providing intermediary services to them. So the point really here is that this is an area where we have to be vigilant and look at it as a widespread cybercrime area because it's not going to be resolved by technical solutions alone. It's not going to be resolved by policy solutions alone. And to follow on Rob's comment about economists, I'm surprised we got through an entire conversation about spam without somebody always raising the idea about if you just tax spam, it will go away, because that's obviously the economist solution.
Robert?
But then you'd create the problem of tax cheats, right? You create a new problem. I think the big takeaway for me is that there are problems going forward, but we don't have the same level of complaints from users anymore. And I think the reason why that is the case and continues to be the case, and hopefully will continue to be the case, is that there has been a great understanding from the community, all the stakeholders, that companies need to have the freedom to be able to look at the data they have and create tools that solve big consumer protection problems. I think going forward, I hope that attitude and perception of that usefulness continues. There are always pressures on that, and I think that it's important to continue to keep that attitude. The other thing I'll note, and I'm bringing this up again, I think that the robocall challenge that the FTC did was something that really was very innovative and very, from a government perspective, something that we shouldn't forget, and we should continue to use that kind of model to allow this kind of multi-stakeholder relationship to flourish. To the extent that we think that there are unresolved issues dealing with spam, not from the user perspective, but maybe from other perspectives, it might be useful to come back to that model, the FTC or the FCC or somebody else, to look at potential ways to spur, corporate and stakeholder innovation to keep addressing these problems.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Spam isn't solved. Spam won't be, but spam's being well handled now. If you're with a big ISP, you don't see a lot of spam, and so you don't perceive it as being a massive problem. I think one takeaway I'd like to see is much more active work on allowing good data sharing, because data sharing between, at the level that it takes place already in terms of spam, allows us to do an enormous amount of blocking. Just being able to share bad IPs, source IP addresses, to say these IP addresses have only ever sent spam, and if you just block them, that's something that you're going to achieve some benefit from. But allowing us to do data sharing around the issues of bots and malware, because that's the emerging problem, and that's the one that's going to sustain spam going forward in terms of the large spam botnets.
Great. Colleen?
So I think the Can-Spam Act was a good base. I think it leveled the playing field. But now I think that a takeaway from this, from the FTC's perspective, is we need to look at the new areas of spam and the new areas that we can get involved in, the areas of social networking spam and those sorts of things. And we just had those cases on the text messaging spam, and just trying to keep on top of where it's morphing, and how we can help not only on the enforcement side, but also on educating consumers and what they can do to prevent this happening to them.
Yeah, and some of those challenges are much more directly harmful to consumers. You don't pay for email, and you don't have limits really on your bandwidth in any serious way that spam would, but you can do with these others. So, well, this was a really great panel. It'll be up online probably tomorrow, and so I want to thank you all, but please join me in thanking a great panel this morning.